and welcome to Conversations on Climate. My name is Chris Caldwell, and this series is produced by United Renewables in collaboration with the London Business School Alumni Energy Club. Today we're speaking to you from the Old Marylebone Town Hall in London, where we had the honour of speaking to London Business School's Vice Dean and Professor of Strategy and Entrepreneurship, Julian Birkinshaw. Professor Birkinshaw's list of accomplishments could fill a podcast on their own, but by way of brief introduction, Julian is a Fellow of the British Academy, the Strategic Management Society, and the US Academy of Management. He holds an MBA and a Ph.D. from the University of Western Ontario, is regularly ranked amongst the Thinkers 50 list of global management thinkers, has published 15 books and hundreds of articles in leading journals. He frequently contributes to the BBC, The Economist, The Wall Street Journal, Business Week and The Times. A consultant to some of the world's leading firms, Julian has a great mind, an easy charm, and an insatiable curiosity. He also has a drive that's second to none, and it all resulted in an excellent and passionate conversation covering topics such as doing business in time of radical change, whether this change is really as radical as we may think, how modern management is evolving slowly from traditional meritocracies and bureaucracies to face the challenge of the day, doing this by empowering individuals, and how this empowerment can help to re-engage post the Great Resignation and hopefully allow for the next generation to work with an alignment of purpose. We then speak about big picture issues, including the global and macro aspects of management thinking, including ESG, leadership and climate, which sometimes seems like herding cats, and society's attitude to disruption. We close with a deeper dive into some of Professor Birkinshaw's most impactful works on business leaderships and innovation and how they fit with the energy transition. It's a conversation that did not disappoint and one that you will not want to miss. Julian, thank you so much for taking the time to come and speak to us.
Yeah, great pleasure.
So, without any further ado, you started your career as a geologist, I believe.
That's right. Yeah. I mean, I did my undergraduate degree in geology, let's be clear on that. No, so I spent 3 fascinating years understanding how the world was made at Durham University in the UK. But actually my first job straight out was in fact in the information technology area. I was basically a computer programmer.
Okay.
That didn't last very long before I went off and did an MBA. So.
Okay. And when you were kind of looking at kind of geology and the natural world, did you ever consider like a career in energy or the extraction industry?
I mean,
or whatever?
A bunch of my friends, colleagues went and joined the big oil companies. North Sea Oil was big in those days. A lot of them went on and did PhDs, and of course had careers in academia or in applied academia, you might say. But yeah, it was quite difficult, to be quite honest, getting a role in those areas. So anyway, business called my name, so that's where I ended up.
Right,
so.
and you ended up going across to Canada
exactly
at a very young age.
Yeah, so I was mid-20s. I moved to Canada, did an MBA there, the Richard Ivey School of Business, as it's now known. And then I stayed for a PhD, and then came back here in the early 90s.
Yeah, rest is history. And what first attracted you to the world of business?
So look, I mean, business. I guess I always sort of thought of myself as kind of going into the world of business without really knowing much about it. I was, trading stocks as a kid. My dad was a managing director in a chemical company and all those sort of things. So that always seemed to be kind of where I'd end up. But what I didn't realize, of course, was that actually you could combine academia with business, which is obviously where I ended up. My grandfather was an academic, a professor of chemistry and biochemistry. So that, in some ways, these things all make sense in retrospect. At the time, it was frankly a bunch of somewhat random decisions born of an interest in something, which then obviously kind of bore fruit afterward. And
in kind of looking at your works, one thing is really clear is that you look beyond the hype.
Yeah,
you just try to look at the world as it is, warts and all. It doesn't, whatever, and you call it as you see it. So I'd say there's a very kind of pragmatic, aspect to your research. But you also note that there's intrinsic motivation in mission. So where do you see the balance between, from your personal point of view, the balance between kind of pragmatism and ideology, if that's the right word?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I I've always, as you say, I've always tried to avoid just falling into the trap of saying that, a new technology is exciting just because everyone else is talking about it, and try to say, is that really what is happening? So in some ways I see myself as almost arbitraging between the world of business and the world of academia, by which I mean, if I stay close to what's happening in the real world, and I spend a lot of time talking to business people like yourself, that allows me to see that academia is moving in, let's say, the wrong direction, and I can, write the piece which says, hold on, guys, this is not actually the way that the world works, and find my way back. And by the same token, if I'm a decent academic, I've got access to frameworks and ideas that only the academic world knows, and I can sometimes bring those into the practical world and do something interesting with them. And a lot of my most successful, shall we say, practical work has really been ideas that other academics came up with first. I mean, there's no new ideas under the sun. So, this concept of ambidexterity, maybe we're going to come on to it later. Organizations have to be good at, exploiting their existing assets whilst also exploring new ones. Well, that's an idea that's been around for 30 years, but I was one of the people who was able to kind of craft an academic story around it, show how it fitted into practice. And as a result, it's kind of one of my most cited pieces of research. So.
And you're also not afraid to take it the other way around, and from the world of academia, write a book and says, management, it's not working anymore.
Exactly, yeah, that's right. No, that's right. I mean, and of course, it's very difficult to say business people, it's not working. I mean, there's lots of evidence that it's not quite working, but to come up with an angle that they then are interested in exploring, that takes time. I mean, I'll be quite honest, it's taken me a long time to figure out the right way of expressing my ideas in a way that actually resonates with business people. And sometimes it doesn't resonate. Sometimes you think you've got this really cool idea and actually it kind of dies. But then you try a different angle. And that's, by the way, that's one of the reasons why London Business School is such a great place, because we have these steady streams of executives coming to do programs with us, right? So I get to try out my ideas with them rather than just trying them out with an academic audience.
One of the central themes of your research is disruption.
Yep.
Yeah. What do you think in your character brought you to be so interested in that area?
Yeah. So disruption.
I'm sorry, just one thing. Could you also define, because your definition of disruption isn't quite what other people might think of it.
No, we must start with definitions. So disruptive innovation, disruptive technology is, and we can absolutely start thinking about various aspects of digitalization and blockchain and things like that. Disruptive technology is something that has a sufficiently profound impact on an existing sector that it causes the existing leaders in that sector to be challenged. In other words, when we see Tesla take genuine leadership from the traditional automotive companies, that's proper disruption as well. But I'll give you another example. The retail banking sector has not been disrupted, because the fact is that the retail banks in pretty much every developed economy in the world are exactly the same as they were. Now, they are potentially being disrupted, but they have not been disrupted. So for me, I have this slightly narrow definition. Disruption is happening around us, but you can't really say that every industry's been disrupted, because some industries, the incumbents do just fine and they sail on regardless, and other industries, you see the incumbents being killed off. So for me, disruption is that specific point. So do you want to go back to your previous question, which was something about why was I attracted?
Yeah. What in your personality and your nature brought you to?
Yeah, so if you look at my 30 years as an academic, studying big companies, studying entrepreneurship within big companies, studying innovative technology, studying management innovation, the constant theme has been essentially, how is it that big established firms are able to adapt? The big question, if you like, is what makes big established companies resilient, or are some of them resilient and others less resilient? So, I was naturally drawn to trying to understand what the sources of disruption were that some companies were able to rise above and to sort of to transcend, and others ended up kind of coming a cropper with. So that's what got me interested in the last 5 years, really, my biggest single focus of my research has been understanding these disruptive forces, and digitization is one, but climate change is absolutely another. Understand these disruptive forces and understand the ways that particularly established companies are responding to those things.
Yeah. And some very interesting research you came up with was the Fortune 500 25 years ago as to today.
Yeah, exactly. So let me just give you in case any readers haven't come across it, I wrote a thing in Harvard Business Review earlier this year, 2022, and the headline statistic was, take the Fortune 500 from last year and guess how many of that Fortune 500 did not exist in any form 25 years ago at the beginning of the internet revolution. And most people, when I ask that question, they say, oh, maybe it was 100 or 200. Some people say maybe it was 300. The true answer is 17. Only 17 of the Fortune 500 are completely new. And of course, it's Facebook, it's Amazon, it's Google, it's Netflix, I mean, Tesla. You can name half of those even without thinking about it. But the point is, there are only 17 of them. The other 483 are companies that have existed way longer than that and have managed to adapt. So most people, this is going back to one of your earlier questions, most people fixate on the world's being disrupted. Oh my gosh, what are you going to do? Well, I'm trying to look at the same data through, as it were, the other end of the telescope and to say, steady on, there's actually huge evidence that the big established companies of today are adapting quite nicely. They have figured out ways of taking new technologies, harnessing it, sometimes circumventing it, sometimes actually going back to what they were doing in the first place because that still works. All sorts of ways of adapting. Elephants have learned how to dance, is the expression that's sometimes used.
Very good. Yeah, we've got, climate is quite similar to that. It's like where you have people believing they're in the middle of a climate revolution. Yeah. And of course, everything's changing, Well, emissions are still going up year in, year out. If we're in the middle of an absolute revolution, well, that wouldn't be happening.
I mean, and this is it. And this is where I don't want to get into trouble because let's be very clear. I absolutely believe that climate change is, the big challenge of our time. But the trouble with climate change, of course, is that it does happen in these very, very infinitesimal steps. And there's always this nagging worry that, you've got this exponential curve and that we're at that point in that curve where maybe everything's going to go really badly wrong very, very quickly. And the trouble is we don't know for sure where we are on that curve. So we have to take it seriously. And yet we also have to recognize that, in the short term, life goes on. And we've got to try to find the right mechanisms for managing the transition in a way that works for everybody. And this is difficult. This is, as I say, this is the big debate at a political level as well as at a corporate level.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And there's we're now getting a little bit philosophical, but there's very polarized attitudes to change. There's very polarized attitudes to radical change in the society. If you look at people who are, people generally, on average, be really excited about a disruptive technology or a disruptive new an iPhone, But people on average will not be excited about changes to society, changes to the way of living. How do you think we can get a kind of more nuanced discussion on radical change?
So as you say, we've got to both look at the societal level in terms of where the world is going, where does the world need to go? But you've also then got to bring it down to what does it mean to me as an individual? And there are some potentially disruptive changes where we can harness individuals' motivation and, if you like, agency to change. And then the challenge is one of simply amplifying that effect. But then you've got the much more difficult ones where essentially we're asking people to pay more for their fuel, a very live debate, but now, and change their lifestyle in ways that, do more recycling or whatever. And of course, those are changes which most people cannot be bothered to make. And I, of course, there's a role for corporates, a huge role for corporates in trying to make these changes as easy as possible. But I genuinely think that the government's role here is decisive. I mean, you look at little silly things like, charging 5p for a plastic bag or whatever it is, the sugar tax, which was watered down but still exists. Small changes by government, significant impacts. Within, weeks or months of those changes, everybody says, fine, let's just get on with it, despite massed opposition before. And of course, we probably have to make even more changes in terms of societal impact on our behaviours. We absolutely must get governments to take those steps. Corporates can work with governments on that, but ultimately, this is policy. And there's a time and a place when actually policy changes, whether it's changes, nudges in our behaviour, whether it's simply more taxes, are the best ways of doing things. And of course, let's not get into a debate about politics, but some countries, shall we say, are handling this a lot better than others.
Some countries are very centrally managed and organised and very good at dealing with big issues like this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But there's a cost.
Yes, exactly.
There's a cost to each of the individuals in their societies. But
Indeed.
So you're never, I think we mentioned before, never one to back away from a controversy and to be calling out management's failures.
Yeah.
That book was 10 years old.
Yeah.
Have you seen there's been much progress over the last 10 years in kind of finding the third way?
And so just to be clear, which of my books are we talking about?
You were talking about Reinventing Management.
Reinventing Management, yeah. So I've seen a lot of progress towards what I call, the alternative model, which for the benefit of the listener who hasn't read my books, I mean, I'm talking about a move away from traditional hierarchical and bureaucratic styles of managing towards much more fluid ways of working. I see many companies experimenting with versions of what I talk about, and big companies like NL, the energy company, ING, the Dutch bank, Roche, the Swiss pharmaceutical company. I see companies who've explicitly taken my ideas and kind of run with them. I mean, I occasionally, it doesn't happen very often, but I do occasionally literally get a call from a chief executive saying, I read your book, I'm trying to put your ideas into practice. I see huge progress, and yet I also see sort of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. And what I mean by that is you see a company experimenting with these new ways of working. They're better. They're more, exciting for people. They harness technology better. They allow more creativity and innovation. And yet, occasionally you'll then get a stumble. You'll get either a financial crisis, or you'll see the company itself has missed its earnings numbers or whatever. And the human reaction then, what they do? They pull back. They go back to doing what they used to do, or they centralize control again. And all these well-intentioned and good efforts are kind of coming to nothing. Now, that doesn't make me want to give up, don't get me wrong. All I'm saying is that we cannot expect progress to just sort of suddenly happen. We have to expect it to come in, as I say, forward a little bit, back a little bit, and so forth. Digital technology is absolutely making it more likely that this will work, because for the first time ever, technology allows information to be shared, vertically and horizontally in ways that it wasn't before. So the traditional hierarchical model, which is a lot about information flowing down through the organization, a lot of that is no longer as important as it used to be. So I'm optimistic, but I don't think we're going to suddenly see every organization adopt these new and better ways of working.
Yeah, it's also with the more kind of remote working, it's a bit more difficult for the natural flow of information that was going from the office, just being in the building with other humans.
No, indeed. I mean, of course, as with all such things, the shift, the natural experiment of remote working that we all had to go through had its pros and its cons, right? And if I'm working from home, by definition, I have a little bit more freedom because there's no boss, watching what I do. But at the same time, he or she is also a little bit less inclined to give me the freedom because they can't watch me. And they've got mechanisms, of course, to monitor my behavior online. So, whenever I talk to companies about remote working, I say, look, we've got to get a balance here, but we've got to just get much better at the basics of delegating decision-making and authority to individuals so that they kind of own their own decisions. And that works from the top of the organization to the bottom. So in some ways, the experiment with remote working has kind of re-emphasized, reaffirmed that basic proposition, which is delegated authority, putting decisions closer to the action, to the people who are best aware of what is needed and giving them the competencies to make those decisions. That is what we should be working on more.
It strikes me, and please tell me if I'm entirely wrong, but climate change is a pretty good example of discontinuous innovation.
Yeah.
Would you agree?
Well, no, let me frame it, because when I teach this stuff, I teach a whole course on what we call business resilience, right, which is about the ability to kind of bounce back. And the first point to make is you've got to be resilient on at least, say, three dimensions, or three time horizons. You've got to be resilient to very short-term shocks, COVID, global financial crisis, where the effect is felt within weeks. You've got to be resilient to the stuff which takes months, if not years, to work through, and certainly digitization is one. And then you've got to be resilient to the things which take decades to work their way through, which of course is climate change. And we sometimes call the first one a black swan event. You've heard that expression, the thing that you kind of didn't foresee, and then suddenly it's there, and you think, oh my gosh, why didn't we think of that? Then you've got, at the other end, you've got the climate change, which sometimes is called a grey rhino. And the metaphor there is, this thing is coming at you. It's coming at you. You can see it a long way off. No one needs to predict this. It's happening. And yet, because it's a long way off, for a long time, you actually just sort of, say, yeah, I can see it's coming. There's nothing we need to do. And then suddenly you've actually got to act. So I do absolutely see the discontinuities happening on these time horizons. Climate change is in some ways the hardest. I mean, everybody found COVID difficult, but the point is there was never any ambiguity about what needed to be done. And the climate crisis, and we can talk about specific industries in a second, but the climate crisis, the question is when do you act, not do you act, if you see what I mean. And for a lot of companies, the smart thing to do, and I don't like to say this, but I'm going to say it anyway, in many cases, the smart thing to do has been to delay. I mean, for a lot of companies, you take the big oil companies, up until now, a lot of them have been absolutely just delaying doing anything, because they could see that the world still needed their oil. Now, I'm not defending that proposition, but we know it is something that they've been doing. And now we are finally starting to see the big oil companies, most of them anyway, taking seriously the need to rethink energy. So.
Yeah, and which kind of brings us nicely to another of your models about the potential ways that companies react to disruption.
Yeah.
Like the oil companies, you have like Ørsted, who's completely transformed the business. You have say Total, who've done a kind of hybrid approach, still doing what they're doing, but leaning into like renewables in quite a big way. And then you've got the more American style, who are just doubling, and the Saudi Aramco, just doubling down on what they're already doing, just trying to make it cheaper and better, and just no, we're good at this, and you don't have the advantages. Do you want to talk about?
Yeah, I do. So I mean, in my research, I've been digging into all these different industries. I mean, I like to separate out the utilities from the big oil companies, if you see what I mean. So when I look at the utilities, which of course are much more kind of consumer driven, I mean, their job is to essentially find sources of energy that create electricity and gas into the home. And you've seen Enel and Iberdrola and NextEra. I mean, you've seen a bunch of these companies actually be incredibly proactive about changing the energy mix. And some of them are now at 50% renewables. I think Enel, for example, is at that level. They're consumer driven, they're heavily regulated. It's not surprising really that they have pushed very hard because they can see ultimately that what they're trying to do is just simply, satisfy the customer market. Now, then you've got the big oil companies, and there's a clue in the name, right? Which is that they absolutely started out being good at one thing only, which is extracting large amounts of oil from the ground. If you look at their transformation, there's a denial for a long period. You had the famous case of BP, which of course, in the early 2000s, before the Macondo rig exploded, Deepwater Horizon, they had a huge renewables business. John Brown pushed that, and they had to actually dismantle it because in some ways they were too soon. And now you're seeing, you might call the second wave of kind of rethinking Total. I think BP is doing a decent job there, Shell maybe. The European ones, broadly, perhaps you don't agree with that, but I would certainly say that the European oil companies have moved rather quicker than the American oil companies.
Safe to say.
Safe to say. For reasons that I think are fairly obvious. I think Europe is generally more progressive when it comes to saving the planet than the US, notwithstanding some factions. And the challenge we face, I mean, I'd love your views on this, but the challenge we face is, is that enough? In other words, are there enough incentives in place for these companies to, shall we say, self-regulate themselves into changing their energy mix? Or do they need a much firmer kick from the governments and the regulators and the taxes? Because at the moment, if I look at the amount of transition I see, and I've been following lots of different industries using very, very simple kind of indicators, it's clear to me that utilities have gone way further than the big oil companies. Big oil is probably the least transitioned industry of them all. The automotive industry, thanks to Tesla, has now finally kind of taken seriously the transition, and everybody is now running to catch up with Tesla. And then you see other industries where you've actually seen dramatic changes. I mean, I'm now moving beyond climate and into other disruptive technologies, but there are some industries which have completely transformed themselves. So I do worry that we are only now starting to see the big transition amongst the oil companies.
Yeah. What I really like to understand is what is your view on whether a carbon credit and some sort of like actual price on climate, perhaps attached to a blockchain or in some sort of regulated market, could that really kind of force the hand of the oil?
No, it's a good way to go further, because at the moment it's not working. In other words, we are not seeing the level of progress we need. Carbon credits, carbon trading. I mean, but by nature, as a sort of a semi-economist, I like the idea that we should try to use market forces to try to, persuade people to act in their interests to do these things. The mechanics of carbon trading, I'm not going to attempt to get into, because it's a complicated business. There are some genuine experts out there who you can tap the views of. But do I think that we should use creative, market-type mechanisms to try to persuade big oil companies to invest more in renewable source of energy? Absolutely, I do. There's no question that this is a means to get them to do what they otherwise wouldn't. Because the way the world is now, and of course we're recording this whilst the Russia-Ukrainian war is going on, the way the life is at the moment, we've just not got enough energy available. So you're going to have to work doubly hard to persuade people to wean themselves off carbon-based fuels right now.
Yeah. You've got the kind of double-edged sword here, where you've got incredibly high temperatures caused, at least in some parts, by climate change, and then the need for you to be turning on your electricity to keep yourself cool at extremely high prices. So, but there's an inherent conflict there.
And the only solution in the short term is indeed that we continue to use fossil fuels, which are still the majority of the energy that we have, whilst pedaling very hard to try to do the innovation and obviously manage the demand side of the equation to try to get people more efficient in using energy to make that transition. But no one's under any illusions that that's still a very, very difficult transition. So.
For sure. Yeah, and you're absolutely right. There's a period of time of how long we will absolutely need to be using fossil fuels just to keep everything going. But it's a question of how long that period is. Like some people are looking at it as 2050. Well, that's too late, guys.
It is too late.
If you take it as a couple of years bridge and you work really hard, then we can make all that work.
Yeah. So again, to stick to my area of expertise, the disruption is climate change. The second order consequence of that is that there are and need to be huge disruptive technologies coming along that enable us to actually make that transition. So lithium-ion battery, that was the innovation that has spurred all the current changes. Well, there's going to be other innovations following that, right? Because we haven't reached the solution yet. We need to have market forces working in a way that enable those innovations to come. That's the only way that business will ever work its way out of this crisis.
Yeah. So one of your kind of central message that's really important for organizations to be setting goals. So that on one side. On the other side, you've got the ESG movement, which says that there's no inherent conflict between shareholder value and stakeholder value.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you agree?
So I wrote a thing that most people won't have read. It was called Purpose with Profits or something like that, Sloan Management Review. And the simple starting point there was, look, in the long term, there is no inherent conflict between purpose and profits. In other words, the companies that have a strong purpose, that have a really clear view of the value they're creating for some stakeholder groups, will be in a position, by virtue of that purpose, will be in a position to make better profits. And the evidence for that is actually quite strong. There's lots of studies have done of the most profitable companies in the long term are absolutely the ones with a higher order purpose. But in the short term, there is an inevitable trade-off, right? I mean, there's no question that next year, if I want to invest in my purpose, whether that's around people, whether that's around innovation or whatever, I am taking money and putting it into some use, which by definition is not yielding me profits in the short term. So I am taking money away from my profits in the short term and putting it somewhere where there is a long-term payoff. So for me, it's a short-term, long-term thing. In the short term, there's always a trade-off between purpose and profits. In the medium to longer term, there is no trade-off. And for me, the answer to that question about how do you sort of almost like reconcile the short and the long term is that you ensure that you've got some sort of mechanism, some sort of forcing mechanism that ensures that you take seriously the purpose. So in one of the articles I wrote, for example, I used this example of the Swedish bank called Handelsbanken. And this is a bank which basically is all about customer focus. They don't have a budgeting system. They have decentralized decision-making into all the branches. They don't have a very, very small head office. And for them, everything is about customer value. They have a profit-making scheme for the branch manager, which only pays out when they retire. So as a Swedish branch manager in Handelsbanken, basically you spend 20 years or whatever running the branch, making a very average living. And then suddenly when you retire, there's this beautiful nest egg for you. And my point is, of course, that is a way of aligning, it's the oldest story in the book in some ways, aligning people's interests with what they're genuinely trying to do. Because if you invest in actually trying to create a sustainable bank, you'll get your profits, when you've proven that sustainability. Lots of such examples out there. My point is that if we're to take climate change seriously, to get back to kind of the key thing here, we have to ensure that our systems are kind of embedding into the way that the company works, some sort of reinforcing device that actually then shows that climate change or sustainability or responsibility is the end goal, rather than focusing on the shorter term goals.
Yeah. I think there's a really interesting example that you brought up a couple of times, and also I think you recommended the book recently, Paul Pullman's book on Unilever.
Exactly, yeah.
Could you like to talk about that was a remarkable transformation?
And of course, Paul Pullman is everyone's favorite example of a chief executive who really took sustainable development seriously with Unilever. His first act essentially was to tell the financial markets that he wasn't going to give them quarterly guidance. He was only giving them annual guidance. And the share price took a dive, but recovered when people realized that actually this wasn't him hiding bad results. It was him trying to actually say, along the lines of what I'm saying, that it takes time to do these things. And if you're going to judge me every quarter, then you've got the wrong metric. And there's he's written an entire book on this subject. It's called Net Profit, is it, or Net Worth? I can't even remember. We have to provide the
net positive.
Net positive. Thank you. The whole point of that book is that this wasn't just a slogan for Unilever. He kind of built it into everything that they did. And he's got story after story about some of the hard decisions he took early on to signal his intent, and then how he kind of worked his way, through the supply chain and through with all his, his brand managers and the products that they're selling, in order to make sure that what they did was actually, linked to those sustainability goals. So, he tells them a story much better than I do, but for sort of a top to bottom reinvention of a company, it's quite impressive. I spend a lot of time sort of in the middle of Unilever, working with people in various different projects, and I'm always sort of bowled over by how how sort of seriously they take this stuff. There's some companies it's a slogan, and some companies you can see them kind of living this stuff on a day-to-day basis, and he's had that sort of effect on them.
If you are like a recent MBA and you're going into a firm, is there a way, like what advice would you give if they are in a passion, they want to make a change?
Yeah.
Is it go to a Unilever or something that aligns with their values, or can you make a difference in a firm as a middle manager?
I mean, the short answer is the former. In other words, I think that, quite honestly, if you're an excitable, ambitious, progressive MBA, your smart advice is choose a company that's already going in the direction you want to go. And that's just purely pragmatic, because it is possible to make a real difference in any company you go to. But I see so many people get frustrated where they can see potential, they can hear glimmers of hope at the top, and yet they see this massive indifference around them, sometimes born of fear, sometimes just born of kind of bureaucratic inertia. And they bang their head against the wall. And some of them are sufficiently, resolute that they keep pushing and they make a difference, but others just give up in frustration. Of course, this works both ways. For the MBAs, my advice is go to the progressive companies who are already showing that they're serious. And of course, that exactly goes to my advice to the chief executives, which is, if you want to hire the best and the brightest, don't be surprised if they are being turned off if you're a little bit slow off the mark. So it's got to be much more than a slogan. But of course, a lot of companies are really making good progress. I mean, I mentioned earlier Enel, the energy company in Italy. I know them extremely well. I spent a lot of time in Roche, the Swiss pharmaceutical company, Unilever, ING Bank. I mean, I see companies across the board, different sectors, trying to really kind of live with this stuff. And those are the sorts of places where we should be gravitating.
But we're living in the world of like the Great Resignation,
yes,
like where it's very like the youth, the younger people seem to be disconnected.
I know.
How do leaders today, like of a different generation, almost by definition, how do they intrinsically motivate?
I mean, I was seeing this is researched a lot, but a research study I saw just last week basically said, what's the biggest single cause of people resigning? Money comes in second, but number one was essentially a lack of developmental opportunities, a lack of opportunities for people to grow and develop within their organizations. So we've got to pay people okay, but the biggest single thing we can do is give people interesting work to do. Now that sounds like such a platitude, I realize, but let me just try to be a bit more practical about it. If you are a mid to senior manager, you're hiring people into roles. What do those people want? They want to do sort of some of your job for you. In other words, they want to be told, here is an opportunity that isn't just what you've defined it as, but is actually an opportunity which can be enlarged into. And so they want to be given a sense of where you want to take it. But you as the manager of those people have got to have the courage to let them go. And of course, we say, we'll do that. But in fact, most of us, when push comes to shove, we're a little bit controlling, right? We like to be on top of things. And the best single advice, which, I need to take this advice myself because I've got a fairly important role at LBS nowadays, is, don't steal other people's decisions. Give them the opportunity to learn and grow and make mistakes. Give them the freedom to kind of create new stuff. And of course, they will more likely stay in their role, and fingers crossed, they will also then reflect that down on their own teams, and so it goes. It's simplistic, but that's the best single advice we've got in terms of trying to get more people to stick around.
Fair enough. Yeah, at heart we are all micromanagers, and it's only being incredibly busy that breaks us out of that. Just pass it on because I can't do it. Yeah. But if you had the time, you would. It's just I think it's human nature.
And we have to just admit that and remind ourselves every day, stop stealing other people's decisions.
In this series, we talk, it's kind of 50% of notable professors, faculty like yourself, and 50% notable alumni. And the notable alumni, the key message that has been coming across throughout all of the interviews so far is purpose. It's, the people we come in, they really believe in what we're doing, and that's what makes them interested, and that's what makes them motivated at it. It was just interesting in that little piece you said, purpose was at best third. Well, for the people I'm interviewing, it's number one.
And look, let's be clear. I mean, I don't want to overinterpret that data in terms of why do people quit. When people say, here are the 5 reasons I quit, trying to figure out which actually comes first or second, I don't know. Look, people want to feel that there's a real purpose in what they do. Absolutely. I wouldn't deny that. But purpose does take many forms. I mean, purpose means, as far as I'm concerned, playing to some sort of goal which isn't just purely money driven. Now, that purpose can be in saving the planet. It can be purpose around, my local community or my immediate colleagues. It can be about just creating a really cool product for my customers. I mean, any sort of stakeholder who isn't just, the financial beneficiary of our activities. All of those different areas count from my point of view in terms of purpose. And of course, each of us is motivated by a slightly different set of drivers. So we've got to be fairly kind of, open-minded about what exactly we mean by purpose.
Sure. Yeah, the whole kind of traditional shareholder value model has been bashed by all sorts of people, even Larry Fink. Can you see that we're moving towards a model of management that incorporates wider stakeholders?
As you say, I mean, it's an 80-year-old debate or thereabouts. I don't know exactly, but we can never get away from the need for companies in our capitalist world to make profit. We have to move to a world, which we are moving to, everybody says this, where a stakeholder view means that we are not giving primacy to shareholders. We are trying to treat shareholders and other stakeholders of the firm equally. As you say, the big investors, the BlackRocks of this world, kind of get that. We're not going to ever get rid of the slightly more rapacious players in the capitalist system. There will always be activists who are out for short-term returns. And therefore, it's the job of the people who are trying to take a more rounded view to continue to push against that and to try to show that in the long run, this more stakeholder-oriented model works. And for me, we can obviously talk about it, but for me, what does that mean for us as individuals in companies at all levels? Is we've just got to keep on reminding ourselves that, profit, making money matters, but we can kind of keep it a little bit suppressed by bringing other aspects of being effective in the workplace to the foreground. So the way I think about it is we all have this sort of money-making aspect to our motivation. And then we have this much more social aspect to our motivation. And to some degree, we also have this sort of, I just want to learn and become better at what I'm doing piece. And the more we can elevate those other things, the more we kind of subdue this slightly more, as I say, slightly more avaricious sort of money-making part of it. We don't get rid of it completely. It's got to be good enough. But as long as we can kind of elevate these other bits, we keep the money-making part in check. And many of us choose jobs, education is one of them, where actually the money-making part is less important. Whereas if you go into banking, unfortunately, the money-making part gets pushed up and everything else then gets suppressed.
Yeah. As a former banker, I can absolutely tell you, it's all that matters.
It's the only thing that matters. And if you could get rid of bankers' bonuses, we would, but we can't.
Yeah, your last 6 months is all anyone cares about. Indeed. And that's, it was a crazy time in life.
Yeah.
But speaking of kind of your role as an educator, we've also been talking kind of in wider stakeholder terms about not just kind of the world of business, but the wider world around us. The kind of the climates and climate transition, as you mentioned before, it's kind of falls to individuals, falls to businesses, and it also falls to governments and society at large. and some would say it falls between the cracks.
Yeah.
And as an educator, I think one of the big things, and this is a slightly long-winded question, but one of the big kind of takeaways of my time at London Business School was the school wants to make a meaningful impact in the way the world does business. Yeah?
Exactly.
Yeah, we are good at that. In London Business School, we are good at that. There seems to be a disconnect between that type of thinking, that type of messaging, to people who are going into the world of business, than to people who are going into the world of politics.
Here's how I think about it, which is, as you say, we have a very clear mission, profound impact on the way the world does business, how business impacts the world. The world of business is changing before our eyes in ways we've all talked about, and London Business School should be developing leaders who have the skills and the mindset to make that difference, whether they go into business or indeed whether they go into the world of policy or government. And I'll be a little bit self-critical here, actually. I think we, London Business School, have not yet done a good enough job at actually taking that sustainability mandate seriously. I mean, I'm not saying we've done a terrible job. There's lots of stuff that we give our students to harness those skills. But we are moving in that direction, and certainly one of my own initiatives as the Vice Dean of London Business School is going to be to help to create much more opportunities for our students to both learn sort of what it is they should be doing as they move into these roles, and also to actually experiment with these things, to actually get into the business of solving the problems of people and planet with businesses. So more experiential learning, more knowledge about what is required, so that when they go into those roles, as I say, both in business as well as in the governmental side of things, they're better placed to enact this change agenda that we're all, I think, kind of converging around. So I'm not sure if this is exactly where you were going with the question, but let me be clear. I mean, sustainability is a vital part of what the world of business needs to think about. Therefore, it has to be a bigger part of what London Business School is doing as it trains the leaders of the future.
Yeah. So you've written on the topic of organizational ambidexterity. Really kind of fascinating topic. So the ability of management to explore new challenges as they continue to exploit old strategies. In the context of the oil majors.
Yeah. So as we touched on earlier, I mean, the oil majors have been very good at doing one thing extremely well, which is, of course, extracting large amounts of oil and such like. And they've now figured out, for the most part, that that's not the only thing they should be doing. And therefore, they are building expertise in doing the new stuff, which by definition is less profitable in the short term than doing the old stuff. And people might even argue with me on that, but I think they would even agree that in the short term it's less profitable, even if in the medium term it's more profitable. So the point is to take this back to almost like the academic theory of it. How do you organize a company whereby you're trying to persuade them to do new stuff which they are less good at, which is less profitable than doing the old stuff? And the short answer is you have to carve out that new stuff into separate units, where first of all they are judged on a different set of metrics in terms of what success looks like. Is it about revenues? Is it about profits? Is it about whatever? And also you have to give them much greater freedom in terms of the ways in which they act. And of course, every other industry in the world has exactly the same problem. I remember I used to teach this case study on IBM, and they had a separate unit called the Emerging Business Opportunities Unit. And of course, IBM, I mean, they're struggling these days, but they made huge profits, of course, in their own hardware and software businesses, but they weren't very good at getting into some of these new services areas. So they had to carve these things out and give them freedom, and they had to have separate reporting lines, and they had to give them much more agency to kind of create the future in the way that they saw fit. And so my point is very simple, that ambidexterity is doing these two different things equally well. In the short term, ambidexterity can only be achieved by actually creating a structure that allows the exploratory stuff to to sort of blossom on its own, and then gradually to bring that stuff back into the mainstream, separate, then integrate, as we say, so that in the longer term, we're actually building ambidexterity into the core of the system, if you see what I mean. So that's in a simplistic way kind of how ambidexterity applies to the world of big oil and energy companies. And remember, this is established firms. When you are Tesla, when you are Ørsted, which has already basically got out of the old stuff, it's a different problem because you are single-mindedly doing one thing. The ambidexterity is particularly important when you're trying to manage from that transitional state from one priority to another.
And that's from the kind of the traditional sector's point of view. In the renewable energy side, you don't have the same level of kind of highly concentrated, highly powerful firms. You've got a whole series of individual players. But if you're talking about, say, kind of taking it into adhocracy, which maybe you can give a little explanation of. I'd posit that the COP, each of the COP conferences that are held are a pretty good example of adhocracy, where kind of a general overall framework is given, and then everyone's just out there trying to do it all themselves.
No, it's a great point, and let's play with it, because in one of my books I made this distinction between bureaucracy, coordination through rules, meritocracy, coordination through argument and getting to the bottom of things. Adhocracy is coordination around opportunity and activity. And adhocracy, I've traditionally thought about it as almost like a startup company is scrambling to create something out of nothing. Classic adhocracy, very few rules. If you bring that into the world, if you like, into governmental organizations, you're right. Something like COP26 was, all the COPs before it for that matter, these were an attempt to create an overarching structure. So you might say that's bureaucratic, but actually, it's a very light touch bureaucracy. What it actually is creating a set of parameters in which we then encourage lots of member states and private companies and so forth to then take action. Now, the risk of adhocracy, at least in the way I frame it, is that you get this disjointed action, that you get a lack of coherence. And so I think that's something to be watchful of, because obviously, you've got to have at least some sense of where people are going. But it is definitely the right way of getting action, because bureaucracy leads to lots and lots of conversations. We need to find a way of turning those conversations to action. So yeah, I like it. I mean, I hadn't actually thought about COP as adhocracy, but you're right. You can definitely frame it that way.
So, what normally like to ask people as a closer is, why should individuals, be them kind of MBA students or people who are looking at this from the C-suites or run their businesses, or people who are just interested in putting their time or their money into this area, like care about what do you care about? I think with from this conversation, it might be a good kind of slight shift of that, and we're looking at a kind of a multi-generational issue in climate change. What advice would you give to the next generation of leaders?
So the next generation of leaders are, of course, our students of today, and I've touched on a little bit of, first of all, go to the places where you can make a difference, and sometimes that is the big companies, the Unilevers of this world, and sometimes it's absolutely social enterprise or some sort of startup activity. Where you can actually start to make a difference, albeit with certain risks, immediately. And then your job is simply, and of course this isn't simple at all, is to make the thing that you create so interesting that then you pull everybody else along with you. And of course, that requires a huge sort of almost like ambidexterity for the individual, right? In the short run, your job is to be single-mindedly, decisively pushing an interesting agenda that you feel passionate about. And then at some point, you have to flick a switch and figure out that it's actually not about you anymore. It's about the people you're pulling with you, because your job is to actually then, open the doors and to release the creativity, if you like, of that next generation. And that's the single biggest sort of challenge any of us face as leaders, it's a fundamental behavioral point which we've just touched on, which is, the old story about, what got you here won't get you there. In other words, to get to a certain level, you've got to be pretty decisive and single-minded in trying to get over the bureaucracy around you. And then once you started to see some success, you have to become much more welcoming of others' points of views and trying to nurture others and trying to make them feel that they're in the spotlight rather than putting yourself in the spotlight all the time.
Are you optimistic?
Yes, I am. And of course, I'm optimistic with this sort of pragmatic bent. In other words, if I didn't believe that we could make progress, I'd kind of retire now. But I'm very conscious that it's hard. It's a hard slog. That every step forward we take, we do take half a step back, and so we just got to keep reminding everybody how hard this is, and then collectively we will make progress.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. That was a fantastic conversation.
Perfect. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.
Cheers.
Well, thank you very much for joining us on that conversation. We hope that you enjoyed it. We hope that you learned something. If you did enjoy it, please feel free to leave a 5-star review and to subscribe to any of our channels, and we'll be sure to keep you updated on future productions. This series is produced by United Renewables in collaboration with the London Business School Alumni Energy Club.